The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The modern world is prosperous, and one of the important tasks for economists is to convince people, including our students, of just how much life is different and better than it was 100, 200, or 300 years ago. There are a number of different ways economists try to do this, but one way is to try to go back and envision or see what life really was like 100 or 200 years ago. Contemporary housekeeping manuals provide a unique way, I think, to see what life was like for ordinary Americans, and by contrast, just how different our life is today. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about life in the 1830s is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Malavika Nair. Welcome back to the show, Mal.
Thanks, Dan.
So let's start by pointing out that one of the most important areas that economists study is the area of economic growth, to try to measure what our living standards are, trying to document how they've changed over time, and then ultimately to try and understand the forces that lead to some societies becoming wealthy. And so when we look at the numbers overall, do we see evidence that there's been of prosperity in the modern world?
Oh yes, it's called the great fact in economic science that our living standards over the past 2,000 years, here's a graph of it, if you look at, so it starts in the year 180 and goes up until 2015. If you look at GDP per capita for maybe the first 1,800 years, it's relatively the same. It kind of stayed between 600 and $1,200 GDP per capita, and something changed in 1800, and you see this large upswing in GDP per capita, where it's up to maybe 14,000 dollars.
This is worldwide here.
Yeah, and this is kind of breaking it up for the different countries. So there's been a lot of growth on average in the world, but that growth is not spread equally. And so countries like the United States and the United Kingdom are much wealthier than countries like China and India. And so the question we ask as economists is, okay, what explains this? Why are some countries rich and why are others poor? And it's one of the largest questions that we attempt to explain.
And then also just to convey to people how it is that standards of living have been going up. And I guess you could try to use numbers like this and a graph like this, but then also sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story, I think, for all people. And we also know sort of in our own lives that we don't necessarily aren't able to for sure be able to track the progress that we see that we actually experience in our own lives. And so sometimes we need to go beyond just the numbers, and maybe it's just a problem when the numbers start to get so big and you think of millions and billions and trillions. There's so many zeros, and so how much better off or how different is this? I mean, you see these numbers here, but the numbers may not have like a human meaning to them. And so what would be some other ways we could try to convince people of how this has changed in our lives?
So that's exactly right. So we care about the numbers. As economists, we care about numbers because ultimately the numbers reflect people's lives. And that's what we're really interested in. We're really interested in living standards and standards of living and what it means to be poor. What does it really mean? What does it really mean to be wealthy? What do we mean by that? What is it? How does it translate into your daily life? And so one way that I found is to kind of explain or show to my students some of these what it actually means to be poor is looking back at historical housekeeping manuals or cookbooks back like 200 years ago.
So tell us a little bit about what we have, what these are, these housekeeping manuals.
So obviously 200 years ago, so there's no, well, more than 200 years ago, back in the mid-1800s, there isn't any internet, there's no electricity, and so women don't have access to things like blogs and magazines and television to, you know, get a recipe from or get housekeeping advice. And so there used to be these books that were written for women by a few authors, and it would be kind of a mix of recipes, some housekeeping advice, parenting advice, things thrown in there, how to have a frugal home. And what it actually gives us is this fascinating picture of what life was like to be a middle-class American. So these books were not written for the wealthy American. It was written for just middle-class Americans of the day. And they were both published between 1832 and 1845. And through looking at all the advice that's been given, we can recreate a picture, a human picture of what life was really like in terms of standard of living, looking at these books.
So this would have been sort of like the accumulated wisdom that was being given out to young American housewives.
Yeah, like sort of like a Martha Stewart of the day.
Okay,
That's what these women
That's probably a good example of this, right? So you don't have Martha Stewart living to read as a magazine, but you did have publications like this. So tell us then a little bit, like, what kind of a life did this describe?
Well, so this is aimed at housewives. So one of them is called the American Frugal Housewife, the other one's called the Good Housekeeper, and basically it's the first thing that kind of hits you is all the advice that's going in about how to keep a house, and it's clear there's no electricity. So simple things we take for granted, just having a refrigerator, you know, it just does not exist. So the amount of effort that goes into keeping food from going bad or basically, you know, because there isn't any electricity to keep it cool, the work that goes into it or into salting meat, I mean, it's a lot of effort that women would have to put in. Other things like mending, you would have to sew your own clothes, mend everything that breaks in the house, wash, there's no washing machines, obviously, you have to wash clothes in boiled water and wash them by hand.
Here's some images of the kind of ways that life was different then.
Right, and it's pretty stark. So things like everybody would make their own bread, everybody would keep cows, make their own cheese, milk those cows, keep their own chickens. You know, if you wanted to eat chicken for dinner, you would have to go kill the chicken. You know, so what we see is a much less division of labor, a much shorter division of labor. You know, less than 200 years ago.
Well, I mean, certainly one thing you can see is that by mending socks or in clothes, I mean, that's an indication of a lower level of prosperity than we currently have, because I mean, I wouldn't consider trying to sew a sock with a hole in it, just toss it away and buy some new ones.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah, even here, think about it, right? Even here in Troy, Alabama, we can just walk into a Walmart or a Publix and buy goods from across the world. I can buy bananas that came from South America. I can buy strawberries that came from California. I can buy, you know, but here there's none of that. The market does not exist, so to speak, and so, or it exists at a much lower level. It's very local. Markets are very local, and so most people kind of grow or build things on their own within the household, and so the household is like the relevant economy.
You know, it is important to note that, I mean, by the time we get into the 1830s, there already had been in the United States and Britain some growth.
Yes.
The household, the American households that were able to like churn their own butter or have clothing that was made outside of the home and have it available were much better off than say 100 years before that, or that most of human history up until that time, right?
Right, but I think what's kind of stark is the lack of electricity, the lack of technology, just basic things that we just every day we take for granted. They don't exist yet, and so the amount of work, the productivity. This is the point that, you know, we try to kind of link to economic growth. When you spend so much time just kind of doing basic things like growing and cooking and cleaning and mending, then all of your scarce resources are devoted to just kind of staying alive and surviving. And so you don't have much left over, or especially as a woman. In the day, all you do is take care of your children and you clean the house and you cook, and you don't have much time left over to do anything. So your productivity is low.
You know, one of the sections that they had in one of the manuals talked about home remedies, and that I think is an important one to touch on and expand on a little bit more, because we didn't have certainly Walgreens or CVS, but in many ways we didn't even have medicine, modern medicine at that point in time, right?
No modern medicine, no antibiotics, right? And so there was the levels of child mortality it's pretty shocking how high child mortality was in the 1830s. So it's about 40%. Global child mortality.
Tell us, what exactly does that mean?
What that means,
40% child mortality.
40% child mortality means that 4 out of 10 children would die before the age of 5. And that's pretty stark. So one of the authors in the book, in the preface, she writes about how she has actually raised 4 children without losing any of them, and so this is what makes her, an expert at how to raise children, because she's very proud of the fact that she's actually, raised children without the death of, and that's right there in the preface, and that kind of shows you that, not losing a child was something that was rare. Today, if losing a child is something that is extremely rare before the child is 5, right? That's the rare event, and that's kind of shown by these numbers, and that's what these books are doing. They're kind of making these numbers come alive. You see a dramatic decline in global child mortality.
And in 1800, when this graph is beginning, I mean, that would pretty much be everywhere across the world. It was pretty much in the same boat. And then as this average falls for the world across, I mean, it's actually falling first for countries like the United States and Britain. And we're the first most prosperous countries initially, but as we see it continue to fall over the last 50 years, it's really showing that a lot of these same benefits are getting out to the rest of the population.
It's falling for Asia, for China, for Africa. Even the poorest countries in Africa have much lower child and infant mortality. It's still higher than the developed countries today, but it's much lower than it used to be.
I mean, another element of the lack of medicine that impacted people's lives dramatically was not just you had child mortality, but you had maternal mortality. That having 4 or 5 or 6 children was actually a very dangerous thing for women to do, right?
I mean, a lot of women would die in childbirth, and with the lack of modern medicine. And what we see in this graph is that those numbers have fallen rapidly through the 20th century as well. So in the 19th century, maternal mortality rates were extremely high. And so, again, that kind of shows you a picture of a much lower standard of living for women, for children, for families, for households.
And before you'd have like a Walgreens where you could go and get the drugs. I mean, there was some knowledge of some things that could be the home remedies. And so there was some knowledge out there that was probably actually contributing to some of these initial declines in childhood mortality. But it was a very different model to try to get that knowledge out there and get it used compared to what we have now, right? You had to rely on the housewife much more to like produce these things at home, right?
Yeah, so all cultures have ancient systems of home remedies and medicine, and that kind of get passed down, but you basically had to rely on your grandmother's knowledge or your mother's knowledge, or the knowledge that had been passed down through the family to make up these home remedies and to basically treat deadly diseases, because there was no modern medicine and there was no division of labor, as we have this great advantage to you just walk into a Walgreens and you can buy drugs that can save you from simple things. People would die of simple infections.
Well, and this brings up another point. Economist Thomas Sowell made reference to, he uses an example of cameras, and the autofocus element of a camera is in effect building knowledge, building expertise into the camera. So if you were an actual avid photographer or knew something about it, you might try to focus the camera yourself, and maybe that would be if you're a good photographer, like no professional photographer would rely on autofocus. But for the average person, then that's a tremendous innovation to be able to have knowledge more built into our products. And that's something we didn't really have back
No.
in the day, right?
No. So today, if I want to keep my food fresh, all I need to do is open my refrigerator, throw it in, and it's fine, right? I don't need to have knowledge of how the refrigerator works, who built it, you know, what parts go into building it, the engineering behind it. I don't need to know that. But without electricity, I would have to have much more detailed knowledge and be much more aware of what it takes to keep my food fresh and how to, right? There would be a lot more effort on my part without a market that I can just kind of go out and, you know, have the benefit of just buying things where I don't have to have the knowledge. I can just engage in exchange, use my labor or use my expertise to be able to exchange for money and use that money to buy the things that, you know, improve my standard of living.
No, you've pointed that many of the specific differences in the households actually come down to the lack of electricity. And that was something that wasn't available in the 1830s in the United States. We didn't have like an electric power utilities or grid at that point in time. So tell us a little bit about how that's really helped, really changed life.
So technology, electricity of course led to the development of so many household appliances and machines, things like the refrigerator, the dishwasher, the washing machine, things, you know, that every average American household has today. The reason that those things improve our standards of living is through the increase in productivity. It's because now, in order to have clean clothes, all I need to do is spend 1 minute putting clothes into a machine and pressing a button, and that's all I need to do. And so the increase in productivity, the amount of input that I put in is minuscule, and the output that I get of clean, fresh clothes each time is so much bigger than the amount of input that I put in. Back in the 1830s, if I wanted fresh, clean clothes, it would take me all day working really hard physical labor to wash those clothes, and so my productivity in terms of the amount of input I put in and the output I got for it was extremely low. And so when productivity increases through things like technology, it leads to a higher standard of living because now it frees up time to do other things. And so it's not a coincidence that, you know, a lot of women through the 20th century, especially in developed as well as developing countries, have had more time to engage in careers, to pursue careers outside the house, to pursue higher education. We see rapid rise in the numbers of women enrolled in, you know, higher degrees, women pursuing careers. Back in the 1800s, it just wasn't possible.
And that's the connection between development and educational attainment is really important as well, right? Because actually it was before electricity, I guess, when they had perhaps the development of kerosene and whale oil that was able to fuel lamps for the average person. I mean, there's a huge connection between progress and knowledge, right?
Yeah. So
education.
It's a virtuous cycle. So we know that more educated people are able to get wealthier and to get you can get a better job when you have an education, and you can improve the standard of living for your family. But the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to engage in higher education as well. So it's kind of like, it is a virtuous circle, but the link is very strong between education and better economic growth.
The ability to light our homes after the sun went down was huge in terms of creating extra time for people to, even when they were largely engaged in agriculture, after the sun went down, they couldn't be working outside, but they could be reading inside. And that was one of the things that really helped allow people to start to become educated.
Yeah,
right?
and that's the link between productivity and knowledge.
Now, one of the important measures then of progress across countries, or when we could go back to the United States to look at it, is would be access to electricity, right?
Right.
And so that's an important measure of progress along the way.
So this is a chart that shows you access to electricity in a lot of developing countries today. So just like we saw, there was no electricity in the United States back in the 1830s, and as a result of that, life within the household was much harder, and women had to work that much harder. And so if we look at today, access to electricity, it's quite shocking. A lot of poor countries actually don't have access to electricity, or still very small proportions of their population. So in Haiti, it's only less than 40% of households have access to electricity in 2014, and Rwanda is even less. Even a large country like India does not have complete access to electricity. And so that kind of gives us an idea of, okay, what does it mean to be poor today? And if you don't have electricity today, again, you don't have access to all of these things that electricity brings. And so the poor people in these countries are probably, their living standards are not very dissimilar from the living standards in the 1830s in the United States.
And you mentioned we talked a little bit about the lack of medicine back in the 1800s and how that helped limit, lead to high rates of mortality. But progress has really helped, and it's specifically electricity, it has really helped reduce mortality in another way as well, right?
So electricity and, right, if you have access to things like medicine, and especially in the developing countries, mortality rates have been rapidly declining as a result of access to things like medicine and things like vaccinations, antibiotics, and electricity as well as technology. But what is interesting is, while it's easy to kind of it's easier to send medicine and vaccinations to countries in Africa or in India, but it's much harder to just, send them better institutions or better policy. And that's kind of the trickier question moving forward into the 21st century. So while in the Western countries there are better foundations or better institutions, as we speak of in economics, that kind of lay the foundation of economic growth, in most developing countries today, those institutions or foundations don't exist still. And so even though there has been large improvements in education, in mortality, in health indicators, those very basic things of just better economic freedom, those things are still way lagging behind.
Yeah. Well, it's just the manuals you're talking about, I know I was reading through some of them, they talk about how the housewife would have to be cooking or baking on essentially a wood-burning stove or oven. And I mean, that's one of the areas in which there was a health, that actually brought up significant health issues. If people had to burn wood inside their homes for cooking or cleaning, or for cooking or heating, it caused a lot of indoor air pollution. And we really know this now because in some parts of the world where they still have to, where they don't have that access to electricity, they're still burning animal dung or wood inside huts, creating a lot of pollution in a small enclosed area. And it could be contributing to as many as 3 million or more deaths per year throughout the developing world. So that's another part of the mortality equation. When you have an ability to heat or cook using electricity, you don't have to be burning wood or dung in your own home, and that's an important value. Yeah, so let's get into this whole question of institutions a little bit more, because we know that although things like electricity or once we become prosperous, we can adopt different types of technology. So we know that technology is important in terms of having growth. We know that electricity is an important part of it as well, and that also having modern factories or having factories. But institutions lie behind getting all those things, right? And so institutions at some level are the bigger puzzle, or the bigger the enabling element of prosperity, isn't it?
Yeah, so institutions are the foundations of a society, or the rules by which we play the game, and institutions shape incentives. Institutions are important because they shape the incentives of the individual, whether or not to start a business, whether or not to engage in trade, or whether or not to engage in profit-making activities. And those are the things that lead to things like innovations and inventions, and just more the broadening of the market and the division of labor takes place when you have entrepreneurs that have the incentive to invest and to create. And a lot of those underlying institutions that support the entrepreneur, things like the rule of law or private property rights, a lot of those don't exist or aren't as strong in a lot of developing countries even today. And so that is the broader question here. How do you improve institutions, and that's just easier said than done.
So elaborate on that if you can some. I mean, how is it that we can't really like export institutions? Because why is that a lot harder? Why is it so much of a harder problem than say exporting medicine?
Yeah, it's so things like medicine or technology or electricity, or think of the internet, right? The internet, there's internet everywhere in the world today. It seems to be really easy to, if you have this technology that makes things easier, it seems to be easy for it to spread rapidly around the world. But if you were to say, okay, let's now export democracy around the world, that gets you into trouble, and it just does not spread that way. And I think it's because economic institutions are controlled by political actors in every country in the world, by the political institutions, and whether or not the political actors have the correct incentives to implement inclusive economic institutions that lead to economic growth. Well, in history, there have been examples of political actors choosing the right institutions and leading to better economic growth for their citizens. But like if you think of countries in Africa and dictatorships, clearly they are choosing economic policies that benefit themselves only at the expense of the people. Now, how do we get them to change their mind, or how do we send better? I mean, that's a complex process.
Well, and another thing I think, wasn't a lot of the growth that occurred in the United States and Britain really sort of like more bottom up than top down? It wasn't really being directed by the World Bank or other international organizations. It just was people acting on their own, right? Within this proper institutional environment, but you didn't need a lot of direction.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem with the top-down approach, is when institutions like the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, when they go into countries and they tell them how to do things, it's not perceived in a good light. Economic growth comes from the bottom up. It comes from the grassroots, from individuals. Those are the incentives we need to care about. We need to care about aligning individuals' incentives with each other in a way that they want to maximize their profit, and the way that those economic institutions support doing that. That's what leads to economic growth, not going in top down telling people this is the way to do things. That's not going to lead to success.
Well, I guess one final thing to think about then is, we've seen progress spreading across the world. I mean, is it possible that we're going to be able to one day abolish poverty in the world?
I sure think so, yeah. I mean, so if you just looking at the numbers, we can tell that global poverty rates are down by large amounts in the last even 100 years. I think it is very possible to abolish extreme poverty, and I think we're well on our way to doing that. But how do we get the entire world to be even more prosperous and to have less inequality? I think those are kind of, interesting and complex issues that we need to be able to answer the question of institutional change in order to do that.
Well, I guess just to sort of sum up here, is one of the things we've seen relative to the 1830s is that the technology and our rising standards of life have really allowed women to enter the workforce, enter the economy in different fashion than they did back in the 1830s. They were clearly contributing. But the housewife has a much different task now, and it's very much for the better in terms of prosperity, right?
Right. So I think it's often overlooked. I think people think of the emancipation of women as just linked to political changes, or allowing women to vote or allowing them to get an education. But it's actually also very much linked to economic factors, and the fact that if you can be much more productive at home and you don't just need to be there physically cleaning and cooking all day long, it just frees up time to do other things. And so the idea that social progress or progress of women has followed economic progress, I think that's powerful.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.